uncle announced my 11-year-old cousin's marriage to a 65-year-old man, calling it an honor. I froze as the room clapped, then I saw Kavia's bruised hands signing, he hits her. That night, I spoke. One voice mine shattered our generational silence, and through that window, sirens screamed. Uncle Dev was arrested. Silence was no longer sacred. It was a shield they used to hide abuse. Not anymore. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. When I was 9, Grandpa Dinesh slapped me right auntie for humming during prayer. I remember the silence that followed. No one cried. No one comforted her. That's when I learned quiet was safety. We didn't ask questions. We didn't comfort victims. We watched, and when I saw auntie's bruised eye the next day, she smiled like nothing happened. That smile taught me how deep silence ran in our blood. Even love was whispered in shame. At 12, I found a torn book hidden behind Grandma's cerise, an old Azel guide. The pages were frayed, ink smudged by fingers desperate to learn. Inside the cover, I saw a name: Priya Bhatt, my cousin. She'd vanished after her wedding. That discovery was the first crack. If Priya dared to sign, she had resisted too. I hid the book in my backpack, heart racing. It wasn't just language, it was rebellion, buried in ink. Janet handed me a new Azel manual and whispered, "Teach Anjali quietly." We met behind the old school shed, tracing signs with nervous fingers. One day, Kavya watched from the shadows. I signed safe, and her eyes lit up. At home, Grandpa Dinesh sniffed my bag. I lied, said it was a prayer book. He smiled, then burned it. That night, Anjali wept. She thought we'd stop, but we didn't. That fire lit our quiet rebellion brighter than ever. Anjali's wedding date was announced during breakfast 3 weeks away. Her hands trembled beneath the table. Mira auntie squeezed mine when no one looked. That night, I tapped Anjali's window twice. She opened it, silent tears falling. "Run." I signed. She shook her head. "Kavya," she signed back. "The little one wouldn't survive without her. Janet warned us, move too fast, and they'll punish all of you." Still, I planned. That night, even fear felt like defiance. I slipped a flash drive to Maya, our neighbor and activist, filled with recordings of whispered conversations and hidden signs. She promised action. Days later, Uncle Rosh suddenly praised Grandpa's traditions at dinner. Suspicion bloomed. Maya didn't return my calls. Had she betrayed us? That night, I stared at the wall where we'd traced freedom in chalk. Anjali leaned over and signed. "Still fight." My hands trembled, but I replied, "Always." Doubt had knocked. We slammed the door. Asha, just 9, copied our signs and showed them to Shandy auntie. Annie froze, eyes darting to Grandpa's closed door. "Forget this," she hissed, but Asha grinned and signed love with her tiny fingers. Later, I found that same word etched into her math book. That night, Grandpa demanded we all pray aloud together. Kavya's voice cracked. I whispered my lines. Anjali didn't speak at all. It wasn't defiance yet, but it was the first fracture. At the family council, Grandpa declared Anjali's groom had arrived. She stood trembling beside him. I stepped forward. "She won't marry," I said, voice cracking. Gasps echoed. Uncle Dev grabbed my arm. "You defy tradition?" I broke his grip. "Yes, I protect children." Grandpa raised a hand to strike. Mira auntie blocked him. Silence shattered. Anjali grabbed Kavya's hand and signed. Run. In that room, war began, not with fists, but with words we never dared speak. Uncle Rav ripped the flash drive from Maya's hand at the gate. "She's returned too late, traitor," he hissed. She pushed him back, shouting, "The world will see this." Grandpa ordered the gates locked. Inside, Auntie Mira whispered, "They'll bury us alive." Anjali whispered, "We show them." We huddled in the prayer hall, each girl signing one word: truth, fear, hope. They couldn't erase that. Our hands moved faster than their rage could catch us. Dinesh Kapoor brought in a priest and ordered a wedding right there. Anjali was dressed in gold, her eyes empty. As vows began, Kavya screamed, "No," in a voice she hadn't used in years. Everyone froze. Grandpa slapped her. That's when I lunged. "She speaks for us all," I yelled. My live streamed the chaos. Within minutes, messages flooded in. Strangers watched, and they chose us. We weren't alone. Even silence couldn't mask a scream like that. Police arrived just as the vows ended. Anjali dropped the garland. Stepping back, "I didn't consent," she declared. Grandpa roared, "She's a child," an officer replied. Exactly. Uncle Dev resisted. He was handcuffed. Kavya clung to Mira auntie, who held her like armor. The flash drive was evidence now. Janet appeared with a court order. "These girls will speak," she said firmly. Anjali grabbed my hand. For once, justice didn't whisper, it thundered through that courtyard. The family fractured. Some aunts wept, others turned away. Grandpa sat alone, silent not in power but in defeat. I walked to him, showed him the sign for truth. He flinched. "You destroyed us," he whispered. "No," I replied. "We saved each other." I turned to join the others. Anjali hugged Kavya. Mira auntie kissed Ashad's forehead. That night, we didn't pray in silence. We told stories, in signs, in words, in songs. We remembered loud and unapologetically. 3 days later, Dinesh Kapoor filed for custody of Kavya, claiming the home was morally unstable. The court agreed to a hearing. Anjali panicked. "They'll take her," she signed. I contacted Maya. She hesitated. Legal threats scared sponsors. Mira auntie began documenting everything: Kavya's bruises, school records. I dug up letters Priya Bhatt once sent to Grandma, begging for help. Asha found them in a sewing box. The system was slow, but our truth was faster and sharper. The court hearing began. Dinesh wore white, played the mourning elder. His lawyer painted us as corrupt, westernized girls. Anjali cried silently. Then Janet entered with a surprise witness, Priya Bhatt. Everyone gasped. Told her hardened. Priya faced Grandpa. "You married me off to a man who broke my bones," she said. "You erased me." The judge silenced the room. Priya showed her wrist tattoo: truth and Azel. She had survived. Now she returned to make sure we would too. The judge ruled Kavya would stay with me, right auntie, and be assigned a child advocate. Dinesh protested, but the court cited video proof and Priya's testimony. That night, Grandpa collapsed. Stroke. They said. Mir hesitated by his hospital bed. "Forgiveness?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "Closure." Kavya drew a sign with her fingers. "Safe." Priya kissed her head. The silence we'd once feared now meant peace. It no longer belonged to them, it belonged to us. The family held a final meeting. Some left, shamed, others stayed unsure. I stood with Priya, Maya, Janet, Mira auntie, Anjali and Kavya. We spoke out loud, in signs, through tears. I presented a plan: secret Azel classes for girls still trapped in homes like ours. Maya pledged funding and Janet offered her school. Priya would teach. Anjali smiled through her healing. This wasn't just survival, it was revolution. Our voices weren't just loud now, they were coordinated and heard. Online backlash surged. Disrespecting culture, they said. Anonymous threats filled our inboxes. Anjali hit her phone. Priya ignored it. Maya went live. Tradition doesn't justify trauma, she said, showing childhood photos of survivors. Andy Mira posted her own story. Thousands responded, some hateful, most hopeful. Janet printed flyers. Silence isn't holy, it's a weapon. We plastered them across the city. One appeared on our gate the next day, written by a stranger. Because of you I spoke. Kavya began drawing signs on every wall. Freedom, voice, choice. Auntie Shanti still whispered warnings, but never stopped her. One night, Kavya asked, can boys learn too? We paused. Maya nodded. Everyone deserves truth. We opened the class doll. The first boy to show up was Ravi, a neighbor's son. He signed sister with trembling hands. His sister stood behind him, beaming. This wasn't just rebellion anymore. It was inheritance handed down, not in fear, but in fire. During an interview, Priya was asked what kept her alive. She didn't flinch. One sign, she said, lifting her hand. Safe. The camera lingered. That clip went viral. Girls across the country began posting their own signs, some in schools, some in kitchens, others behind closed doors. Asha, now 10, led her class in Asal morning prayers. We don't need to be loud, she told her teacher. We just need to be clear. The silence cracked nationwide. Mira Auntie started translating folk songs into sign language. At a local festival, she performed one in full Asal. The crowd stood in stunned silence, then applause erupted. Some elders scoffed, most wept. Anjali clutched my hand as the chorus signed home. Asha danced, fingers moving faster than feet. Even Auntie Shanti clapped. Not all change word. Some came in rhythm, in echoes. Grandpa watched from his wheelchair. He didn't speak, but he didn't stop us either. Anjali received a letter from a girl in Kerala. I showed your signs to my grandma, it read. She cried. She taught me more. Anjali cried too. Then she began recording lessons, short, quiet, powerful. In one video, she signed, I'm not ashamed. It trended under signs of strength. Maya cheered. Priya smiled. I watched Anjali glow in ways tradition never allowed. We weren't saving just ourselves anymore. We were rebuilding a language our silence had buried. One sign at a time. During a school debate, a boy mocked Anjali's sign videos. Want attention? He sneered. A hush fell. Anjali stood, signed enough, and walked out. The teacher called her brave. That night, 20 students posted their own signs. Unity, justice, enough. Kavya designed posters from them. Andy Mira distributed them across 3 districts. What started as defiance became curriculum. Not everyone accepted it, but fewer dared to shame it. Silence still lingered, but now it trembled beneath every classroom bell. Maya arranged for our group to speak at a regional youth summit. I panicked. Public speaking still terrified me. Use your hands, Janet suggested, so I did. I signed our story before hundreds, Asha translated. When we finished, the room rose in silent applause, hands waving, tears blurred my view. Afterward, a teen boy approached. My sister's in that silence too, he whispered. Can I learn? I nodded. Sometimes change doesn't start with fire. Sometimes it's a whisper back. Priya started a late-night hotline for girls in silence-bound homes. The calls poured in. He locked my books. One said they said love is shame, said another. Each story mirrored ours. Anjali and I took turns listening, translating, guiding. Mira Auntie lit candles for each girl, hundreds by the week's end. One night, Kavya asked, who lights candles for us? Asha replied, we do. That moment, I realized we were no longer survivors. We were guardians of fire. Shanti Auntie approached me one evening, eyes wet. I knew she whispered, but I was afraid. She held a box. Inside were letters from women in our family, some dating back decades, all silenced, all longing. I read one aloud. If I had voice, I'd scream. We copied those letters, translated them into Asal, and turned them into a traveling exhibit. At its launch, Kavya stood before the crowd and signed. They screamed through us now, and we listened. One morning, Grandpa's old prayer bell rang. We found him sitting beneath the peepal tree. Frail, crying. I silenced generations, he said, and now I can't silence my regret. Priya signed rest toward him, then turned away. Forgiveness was not owed. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but acknowledgement, that was the seed. Kavya placed a signed poem at his feet, her own words. Pain passed down ends with me. The wind stirred. He nodded. Maybe that was his first truth. The Ministry of Education called. They wanted our Asal program scaled, nationally optional, not mandated. Maya pushed back. Anjali asked, are our lives optional too? The room stilled. The next day, a dozen girls walked into the ministry office, signing silently. Cameras rolled. The minister relented. Asal would enter classrooms next year, not as charity, but as language, as power. Priya wept. Asha laughed. I exhaled. We hadn't just broken silence. We'd taught the country how to listen again. At the 1-year anniversary of our uprising, we held a silent march, over 1,000 people, all signing truth home enough. Media called it the loudest silence India ever heard. Hafsa led the front. Anjali walked beside her, hand in mine. Priya carried a banner, no more quiet pain. Asha passed out sign language pamphlets. Maya held the mic but didn't speak. Instead she signed, thank you. We didn't just reclaim our voice, we made silence ours to command. I stood at the courtyard wall where it all began. Kavya traced freedom again, this time in blue chalk. I touched my throat. Once afraid to speak, now I taught others how. Mira Auntie lit incense beside me. This time she whispered, we're not praying for silence. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full of everything we had once been told to bury. Janet handed me our first published guide, Signs of Home. My name sat on the cover. So did Anjali's, Kavya's, even Asha's. We each wrote a chapter. Asha's was called Small Hands, Big Words. We laughed reading it aloud. I never imagined legacy would be made with fingers instead of voices. But this was ours, and it would echo louder than any scream ever could. I visited Priya's old room, now a learning space. Her childhood diary sat open. One page read, maybe one day, silence will serve us. I underlined it, then wrote beside it, it did. Asha added a drawing, hand signing hope. We left it on the desk, unguarded, for every girl who'd enter after us. Because silence didn't break us, we broke it, and stitched something stronger in its place. Uncle Dev received a 5-year sentence. Grandpa was deemed unfit to testify. Mira Auntie gained legal guardianship of Kavya and Asha. When the judge signed the papers, Anjali signed free in the courtroom. The crowd, teachers, neighbors, even former skeptics clapped, some in applause, some in signs. We didn't just end a cycle, we documented its burial. In ink, in law, in legacy, Maya was invited to speak at the end. She took us with her digitally. Asha introduced the segment. Anjali signed her part. I read our final statement. In every home silenced by fear, let signs be the spark. The room stood, some cried. We weren't just survivors, we were signals, bright, persistent. We taught the world to listen. Now it was finally responding. Our old home became a center, the Kapur Morgan language shelter. Painted in sky blue, its walls read truth, choice, future, and dozens of signs. Kavya led the first tour. Priya cried. Grandpa passed quietly months later. We held no ceremony, just a silent gathering, signing peace. He left silence behind. We turned it into a language, and finally, into light. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.